Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. We're going to start right away here. And good afternoon, and welcome to the Sensible Financial Planning webinar series on older adult living. Today, I'm going to be your moderator. Today, Sensible Financial's founder, Rick Miller, and senior financial advisor, Laura Williams, will be speaking about older adult living options. Rick Miller holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and started Sensible Financial 20 years ago this April. He's also a certified financial planner. Laura Williams has a degree in finance from Bentley University and holds both the certified financial planner and the chartered special needs consultant designations. She's been with Sensible Financial for nearly 8 years. The first two webinars that we're doing here, one on housing issues for older adults and potential solutions, and the second on long-term care and long-term care insurance, are available for viewing on Sensible Financial's website at sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. Today's webinar will address housing options with an emphasis on financial implications. Next month, in the final webinar in this series, Rick and Laura will review continuing care retirement communities, or CCRCs. You can register for upcoming webinars through a link in Sensible Financial's March newsletter, which will be published later on this month, or at sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. Rick and Laura will answer questions twice today, once approximately midway through the webinar and once at the end. Please submit your questions through the Q&A link at the bottom of your window, and Rick and Laura will answer as many questions as they have time for. Finally, we will display contact information for Rick and Laura at the conclusion of the webinar. Now, Rick will begin by highlighting conclusions from the series. Rick and Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Bobby, and welcome everyone. Older adult living options is a very broad area, and even though we're presenting 4 webinars, we're just scratching the surface. Laura and I hope that you will take away 3 main ideas from the 4 webinars. First, while each person's and each family's experience will be different, those experiences will likely fall within a somewhat predictable range. That broad predictability offers people and families an opportunity to plan for a relatively small number of general contingencies. When specific situations then arise, people and families will be better prepared to respond effectively and to achieve outcomes that they're happier with. Second, the path of least resistance when people need help is for family members to provide it. This can have a lot of advantages, some of which we will discuss today. There are significant costs too, however. Providing such care is a big responsibility. It can be exhausting with long-term consequences for the caregiver. Managing that commitment can help families maintain their own health and well-being and prevent the caring commitment from taking over the entirety of their lives. Finally, and for Laura and me as financial planners, a major point, long-term care isn't 100% an additional cost to be dealt with if the need arises. Every financial plan can adapt to supply some resources to apply to long-term care. Many planned expenses will be lower if someone needs long-term care. Now, let's move on to discussing housing options. And we're going to begin with a couple of slides that we used in the first webinar, just to orient ourselves a little bit. Today, we're going to discuss let me start with saying what we're looking at here. We're looking at a spectrum of care on the horizontal axis here and delivery models on the vertical. And on the horizontal axis, we're looking at no care to lots of care. These are intentionally vague terms. And on the vertical axis, we're looking at a delivery model that at the top is do it yourself, and at the bottom is hire it out. And in the middle, there are varying degrees of hiring out and doing it yourself. And today we're going to focus on some help needed and more help needed, and doing it yourself or taking care at home, and then taking care in an independent living facility with help, and assisted living.
Okay. As Rick mentioned, a lot of this information up front we reviewed during our last webinars. And if you missed those, you can check out the recordings on our YouTube page. But again, for today, we're focusing on some specific examples of needing some care at home or some care in an independent living community, as well as assisted living.
And we're going to start by thinking about just the simply what the options are and why this is a financially complex decision. If we start by thinking about buying a house, leaving aside the older adult housing options question, buying a house is very complicated. You're thinking about the neighborhood that you're going to buy the house in. Maybe you're thinking about schools, thinking about how far it is to jobs and shopping and amenities. And you're thinking about the physical property itself. Do you like it? Do you like the ground? Do you like the way the home is put together? And does it fit with your family needs? Older adult living decisions have to factor in most of these considerations. And in addition, you have to think about the care that's provided. There may be other services that are provided. And the older adult housing option may also provide management of services, management of housing, management of care. Some housing choices may be more financially efficient for one level of care than for another. And that's what we mean by relative costs of housing options can vary with care needs. All housing choices, whether at home or in a facility, require management. Decisions about the housing, decisions about care, decisions about other services. Somebody's got to provide that management. And what makes this particularly complicated is that housing option pricing combines all services, and families are on their own to parse out the factors and project the costs of each option.
Okay, so today we're going to be reviewing Sally Sample's financial plan. Sally's in her early 80s and she is wealthy. She has almost $2 million in assets, including her home equity. And she has regular income each year from her pension and from Social Security.
And I wanted to add that we've chosen to discuss a single person today. And if anything, these decisions are more complex for couples because couples may have different care requirements, they may have different preferences, they may have different caregiving and management capabilities, and they may have different beliefs about how much care and other supports required, and whether the spouse needing care or needing less care can provide it. And I say here, denial is not a river in Egypt, but we see not infrequently that one spouse or the other has a different view on how much help might be needed.
So when we take a look at Sally's financial plan, we've determined that Sally can afford to spend $70,000 every year on what we call consumption expenses. You can think about consumption as day-to-day living, and that's the amount, $70,000 shown in the chart there, she could afford to spend every year now through her age 100, if she chose to stay in her home, and if she needed no care throughout the course of her life. If that were the case at Sally's age 100, she would have no financial assets remaining, but she would still have her home equity. Based on Sally's current spending, we're showing that she spends about $37,000 just on consumption each year. So there's some financial flexibility in her plan in terms of paying for care she may need. To arrive at how much Sally can afford to spend each year on consumption, we take a look at Sally's lifetime balance sheet. And a lifetime balance sheet starts by adding up all of someone's lifetime assets. So this includes savings that she has now, her financial accounts, but it also includes future income that she's going to be receiving from Social Security and from her pension. And that is a pool of assets that we're totaling about 2.2 million. We next calculate how much Sally will spend on what we call committed spending. And there's a few different categories of spending that goes into that. First being taxes that Sally will owe on her retirement accounts, as well as any income she has. All of her future housing expenses, so property tax, insurance, utilities, and maintenance, and special and insurance expenses. Insurance expenses for Sally is going to include Medicare expenses, and special expenses are going to include anything that might be lumpy or irregular. A common example of this is a car purchase. It's a type of spending that you're not doing every year, but you might need to purchase a car every 7 to 10 years, for example. So we look at the difference between Sally's pool of lifetime assets and her committed spending, and that tells us what pool of assets is available to fund consumption spending over her life. Because we mentioned on the last slide, Sally could afford to spend $70,000 a year, and she's only spending $37,000. There's a portion of that pool of assets that we're calling a surplus. She doesn't need it to fund her planned spending. And in her plan, that's a little over $600,000. What's also not captured on here is that, as we mentioned in this scenario, Sally is living at home. So she has the financial surplus, and she also has her home equity. All right. So next, let's think about other alternatives. We talked about Sally choosing to stay in her home for life and how she could afford to spend $70,000 a year on consumption. But one alternative is Sally might choose to move to a community, like an independent living community. If that were the case, Sally would sell her house, and selling her house gives her more financial resources. Her home equity would then be able to potentially fund higher consumption, as an example, if she didn't require any care. And you can see the value of that by looking at the yellow box in between the two bars here. So that would afford Sally an extra $16,000 of spending each year between now and her age 100.
That picture is a little bit incomplete, however, because it doesn't capture the fact that she's spending more on housing in the independent living community than she was staying at home. Her net cost of housing doubled roughly from about $18,000 a year at home to about $36,000 a year in the independent living facility. So she's spending a good deal of her home equity on her independent living housing. And we can see that by looking at the table. We see that if she stays at home with no care, then her surplus, as Laura said, was about $600,000. Her home equity is about $532,000. And her estate, if she lived to 100, would be a little over $1.1 million. When she moves to independent living, she has $920,000 in surplus, but that's more than she would have had if she stayed at home, but she's used her home equity. And so the net is smaller. It's about $228,000 smaller if she moves to independent living, doesn't need care, but she does get the extra services, which we're now going to look at. In addition to her housing costs, her discretionary spending may change also. And there is some reduction to be expected because many independent and assisted living communities cover some day-to-day expenses. And we've looked at here Sally's discretionary expenses and what she would spend each year on those discretionary expenses if she was living at home with no care. And we've also looked at what she would spend if she needed some care. Many of these expenses are potentially lower if she is staying in a independent living building because they may offer entertainment. They may provide transportation. They may support exercise. And all of these are services that, if the independent living facility provides them, she won't have to pay for. And so her bill, if you will, for consumption or discretionary spending might be lower if she lives in an independent building. So this is the first illustration we have of how making an accurate comparison between the alternatives requires identifying services that the housing option provides as part of its fee, those services that Sally was previously paying for directly, and in addition, or not in addition, but rather she may spend less on discretionary spending, but her living standard may be unaffected. She may be enjoying the same lifestyle, even though she's spending less out of pocket for those services. Now, there's a further complication, which is that at some levels of care, Sally may spend less on some goods and services and activities simply because she wishes to spend less. And our living standard analysis has to reflect that too. And that's what this some care column represents. So you see that if she's needs some care, that she may spend less on certain items because she's just the best example probably here is travel. If she needs some care, she may be likely to travel less. And this is a good point to stop for questions for our first question break.
Absolutely. You have a couple of questions already, Rick. And if the audience members wish to put additional questions, just hit them. Drop them into the Q&A. So your first question is from Nancy, who is interested in finding out if Sally has long-term care insurance.
We haven't factored long-term care insurance into this particular example.
Okay, and we have another question here. You mentioned during this presentation that those who care for loved ones are more likely to need care themselves. Why is that?
There are a number of reasons for that. One is that providing care is tiring, and especially if it's a lot of care, it can be both physically and emotionally stressful. Many caregivers find themselves in a situation where they have no respite, where they're providing care all the time, and they have no independent lives of their own. And that can go on for a very long time. And you can imagine that if somebody's doing something that's tiring and emotionally and physically stressful and doing it for a long time and not getting any breaks, that's eventually likely to have an impact on their health. And that's the fundamental reason that that's true.
Okay. And next question is, why would Sally move to independent living if she's worse off financially?
So we've not factored everything into the analysis here. So there are both financial reasons and non-financial reasons. From a financial perspective, as I said, the facility may provide some products and services that she was previously buying out of pocket and would now be included in the service list that she can get from the independent living building. So the analysis can be incomplete. So that's the first reason. The second is that she may appreciate the potential availability of care if the building also provides assisted living, and many buildings do provide both services. And finally, she may appreciate the management that the building provides. She's not responsible for maintaining her house anymore, so it's kind of the if you will, the reason that some people like to move into condos, right? There's no, they don't have to mow the lawn anymore, shovel the snow, and that kind of thing, because the building takes care of all of that. So that's a final reason.
Okay, we have another question from our audience. What's the difference between the two shades of items in the no care / some care table?
The intention here is that the greener color are items that the community fees cover or cover some of. So it may be that if you're in an independent living building, that the community provides movies and access to Netflix and that sort of thing. It may provide some transportation. The building may have a van to take people shopping and that sort of thing. And in some cases, they also provide exercise opportunities. So they'll have a fitness center and maybe a personal trainer and that kind of thing. So there are, on the other hand, the ones in the grayish color are intended to reflect areas where Sally wouldn't perhaps spend as much if she needed care. So travel is an example of that. She may spend less on clothing. Conceivably, she might also spend less on food in a circumstance of that sort. And we're not intending to be exhaustive here, but just to suggest that there are some areas where the building will provide services that she doesn't have to pay for. There are other areas where she may need less of those services if she needs care, and in some categories, both may be true.
Okay. We're also being asked if there's anywhere of that someone could basically plug in their specific numbers and see what the results would be.
That is an excellent question. And there's an entrepreneurial opportunity just begging to be filled, is my response. I'm not aware of anything of that sort at this point. And it would be that's now that I think about it, I'm very serious. There really is an entrepreneurial opportunity there.
Okay, we have another question. Can you comment on moving to a state with no state income tax? Is this typically a major factor?
Interesting question. It's not the central point of our discussion today. One thing that I would say is that the differences in total payments to the state, let's say, the differences between states with no income tax and states with an income tax is smaller than might at first appear, because states have to fund their operations somehow. So they may not have an income tax, but they may have a sales tax. They may have a lot of fees. So it's if you're making a full comparison, you got to look at all of that sort of thing, and it's likely to be a very personal decision.
Okay, and we have time for one more question here. My 86-year-old mother has a very modest income, around $3,000 in pensions and Social Security every year, but her military health care is virtually free. If the assisted living is $4,000 a month and she has about $240K in assets and no home equity, it seems like she could afford it given her advanced age. I'm not looking for a full analysis, but what's missing from my thinking about this?
Oh dear. That's what I would suggest is that that whoever's asking the question send us an email, and we'll take a shot at that. It's difficult to address individual situations in a setting like this.
Okay. All right. I guess we're all set to move on to the next section. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So as Rick talked about, there may be changes in spending based on a person's specific situation and how they spend versus how that might change if they need care, as well as changes based on where they choose to receive care and whether any expenses they incur cover other types of spending. But we did want to take a look at a couple different scenarios for Sally if she were to require different levels of care. As Rick talked about, there's a wide range here. So the scenarios that we're showing are hypothetical. In each of them, we assume that Sally starts needing care around age 90, and that care continues at the same level until age 100.
And let me just say, based on personal experience, that 10 years of care is a lot of care. It's a long time. My mother needed care for more than 10 years, but very little of it was assisted living. A lot of it was while she was at home, and then some more of it was while she was in independent living. But it started at a very low level. But 10 years of care is just a long time for it to last in general. And finally, when people think about care, they may think about needing a lot in terms of hours per day, but the total cost depends both on the intensity, say hours per day, and also how long it's required.
Okay. So we next reviewed 2 scenarios in which Sally starts to require some help. And in this specific example, we're thinking Sally might need 2 hours of care each day. So on the left here, we're showing the same figures we looked at before. Sally needs no care, whether she's at home or in independent living. And on the right is what it looks like if she needed 2 hours of care each day. If Sally were to move to independent living, she can receive exactly the amount of care she needs where she is. However, this might not work the same if she stays at home. So if Sally only needs 2 hours of care each day, it's possible that the service providing care to her may have a minimum that she needs to meet. So an example of this could be the minimum is 4 hours a day per visit. And in that case, if Sally wants to stay at home, she may have to cover extra hours in order to meet those minimums. I think one other interesting point on this chart here is you can see the extra annual spending that the independent living option affords Sally because she only has to pay for those 2 hours versus the 4 hours. So the yellow bar in the chart where she needs help is much greater than it is compared to no care. So the advantage is a lot greater when she starts needing care, if you think about the difference between assisted living and, independent living and staying at home.
And in this case, the care savings associated with the independent living option leads to a larger estate for Sally. So 10 years of care at $48,000 a year is a lot. And by the way, we've used the cost of care in Massachusetts for the hourly cost of care here. Because in independent living she has lower care costs, that more than offsets the higher housing costs, and so you see here that the advantage of being at home in this circumstance is actually negative. She's a little better off financially from being independent and in independent living with 2 hours of care than she is at home with 4 hours of care. So there's a change here. The advantage shifts to independent living in this circumstance. And it's really important. The key assumption here is that some of the care at home time is effectively not useful to Sally. And that's a major assumption here. And notice that we're emphasizing that independent living in this case offsets the lower care costs, offset the higher housing costs. And we are emphasizing with this pattern of needs and costs. So each situation is different. We're not saying that independent living is always better if you need a little care, because it may be, for example, that especially if we're thinking about a couple, that a family member might provide that care, and then there's no wasted time. So it could be advantageous to stay at home in that circumstance. We're assuming also that when she needs some care, that Sally's discretionary spending is going to change. And when she needs care, she's going to spend less by choice. And the spending that we're assuming is lower by the same amount at home or in independent living, those savings can go toward care. Now, coming back to the analysis that we looked at before, where we looked at how discretionary spending is affected, in the case where she needs, and now we're moving to a situation where she needs even more care, and this is preparation for that discussion. If she needs even more care, then the amount that she might pay for these various items might be even less. For example, if she's in assisted living and needs lots of care, she may not need to spend anything on exercise because the assisted living facility provides all of it. It provides most of her transportation. She does even less travel, which is a decision, a preference decision that she makes. And but the facility offers even a higher percentage of entertainment in the cost of the service and provides most of the food that she needs. So again, more complexity in the comparison.
Okay. So in the final set of scenarios that we looked at for Sally, we were focused on the more care scenarios, whether she receives more care in her home or if she were to receive that care by moving to assisted living. This is difficult to analyze because there's a lot of factors to consider here. You're thinking about housing, you're thinking about what care you need, how many hours of care you need, what services are covered in the assisted living community that might not be there and if you were to remain in your home. And you also have to factor in who's managing care for you. In this particular example, we were considering what if Sally stays at home and she needs a lot of care, and we assumed 8 hours for our example. And that says living at home becomes difficult if you want to ensure that your financial assets remain through age 100. You might have to choose to spend less or at some point sell your home and move to assisted living. And assisted living is an option that would give her the ability to fund a lot of care and reduce the risk of depleting her assets prematurely.
And there's another factor going on here that, as Laura said, we've not been explicit in specifying the care hours for assisted living, but it's likely that it can be lower than the amount of care hours that she would need at home because there's no travel time and because there's, if you will, caregiver sharing. If multiple people who need care are living together, then they can share caregivers. Of course, you may not want to share a caregiver, and that would be a reason to not prefer assisted living. And finally, and this is a point sort of financially in favor of assisted living, we did not include management costs explicitly in the stay-at-home scenario. So we included care costs, but we didn't include the costs of managing that care. So deciding whether it's 8 hours or 9 hours or 7 hours that are required, and dealing with whether there might be a caregiver that you're not so fond of, or who has habits that you're not enamored of. So those sorts of services are available in assisted living, and must be provided by either the person that we're talking about at home or by their family. Again, we're going to look now at the impact on the estate and the impact on surplus. So 10 years of care at 8 hours a day, or 10 years of care at $96,000 a year is very expensive, and that almost exhausts Sally's estate here. You see that she's exhausted, used up her surplus, and had to borrow, in effect, probably against her home, over $300,000, but her home equity is still 500, so she's net. Her net is 218,000. If she moves to assisted living, we're showing, again, with this fact pattern, just less than 600,000 in the estate for Sally at her age 100. So the advantage of staying at home is still less, or sorry, that the disadvantage of staying at home financially is larger. In addition to what we're showing here, when more care is required, the hidden costs at home are likely to be higher because more care management is likely required, and also more management of other kinds is required too, because the recipient of care is less able to provide it. So things that Sally might have been doing around the house, she may have to pay someone to do. So that could increase the cost of being at home further. When we're dealing with someone who needs care, we can also be dealing, we may also need to deal with transition issues. If Sally stays at home and her needs for and costs of care increase, she may reach a point where assisted living might make more sense for her. Someone needs to decide. Someone needs to decide when that time arrives. Someone needs to decide which assisted living facility will be best, and someone must make the arrangements. And it's important it's most helpful if Sally has been able to, with her family, decide, family and friends, who will make or help to make that decision. She may have family and friends who can help, or she may face the decision by herself. In either case, it can be very helpful to have professional advice. Similarly, if Sally is in independent or assisted living, her need for care may outgrow the capabilities of where she is. She may need to transition, let's say, to nursing care. And a similar set of decisions becomes important for someone to make. The facility may be well equipped to recognize when a move is indicated, when, in effect, the requirements, Sally's requirements, exceed what they can deliver. And they may have ideas about where she might go and how to carry out the transition. But family and friends can have important contributions to make on where might be best. But they've got to be engaged as the decision is occurring, or they'll find that the transition occurs without their input. So whichever way you choose to go, it's important to pay attention to care needs as they evolve. Okay, so we're ready for questions again. We've walked through a situation where we've compared staying at home and independent living when no care is required. We've compared staying at home and independent living when some care is required, and we've compared staying at home and assisted living when a lot of care is required. So those are three different circumstances with three different levels of care need. We've in our examples shown that, or suggested that in the cases where care is required, that financially the facilities have the advantage. That may not be the case. It depends a great deal on the facts and circumstances on the ground, as is said. So perhaps we can take that up in the Q&A.
Excellent. So if you have a question to ask, if you can add it to the Q&A, that would be incredibly helpful. That way we don't lose it in that fast moving chat. So I did see a couple of questions there. There was some commentary, Rick, earlier about some caregiving companies maybe requiring 4 hours per day or a minimum of 12 hours per week. Didn't know if you want to address that.
Yes, I think that the minimum is for us one of the more important points, right? It's something of a disadvantage for people at home, and it it can be a special disadvantage if there is a minimum per visit, and let's say that the person who needs help needs a little help in the morning and a little help in the evening. So that's 2 visits and two minimums that have to be satisfied. And in a building where care is present, that's much easier to manage because you're not dealing with travel time fundamentally.
Okay. Our next question is from Lawrence. How much lead time do you recommend for deciding and moving into a CCRC? Just typically in your experience, I realize this will vary widely based on individual circumstances.
Okay, so we're going to talk about CCRC specifically next time. But if we think about decisions about moving away from home and perhaps choosing independent living or perhaps choosing assisted living, it is wise to think about it well in advance, well before it seems like it might be needed. Once it's needed, then there can be, time is compressed, and it's difficult to do the due diligence that is required to make a decision that everybody's happy with. So without being specific about the time, the amount of time, because I think that varies from person to person and family to family, I would say that it's important to think about it and discuss it before it's needed. And I think it's worthwhile to visit places. If you're thinking about independent living or assisted living, it's a good idea to visit them before there's a need, and before perhaps there's even an inkling that there might be a need, because this decision, in my experience, this decision is best made as part of a conversation between spouses, between individuals and their families and their children, and it takes time to work through that conversation and the thought process, and the decisions that are made are going to be better the more carefully they're considered, and it just takes time, because taking a decision to move away from home into another way of living, because a lot of these buildings are communities, right? So you're deciding to leave home and move into a new community, and that includes the services and the capabilities, let's say, of the buildings you're considering, and the appointments of those buildings and where they're located and all of those things, and also the community of people that live there, and those communities vary one to another, and people may be more comfortable in one community than in another. So it's not just the facility that we're talking about; it's also the whole package, and I would encourage people to think about it at least as long as they would consider buying a new house, and doing at least as much looking as they would buying a new house, and probably longer, because it's more complicated.
Let's move on to the next question. Are the care needs determined most helpfully by a medical power of attorney?
That is an excellent question. I think that's going to depend on the particular circumstances. Some people, as I said before, may be unwilling to admit that they need help. And in those circumstances, it's important to have at least an outside, an objective person helping with that decision. It could be the healthcare power of attorney. It could be a physician. It could be another professional. There are professionals who work with adults looking for housing options, and they can assess and determine how much help might be needed and also which facilities might be better positioned to provide that sort of help.
All right, our next question. Any online tools that one can use to do these kinds of analysis? Maxify?
Laura, do you want to take a shot at that? You've certainly used Maxify a lot.
Yeah, you can model these types of things in Maxify, but it requires careful thought about what assumptions are changing. You might be modifying the living standard over time based on how much care you're assuming. There might be changes to housing. You might want to capture cost increases that might be expected at different care communities. It can be done, but I just encourage people to be careful about what they're assuming in their modeling.
All right.
And as far as, let's say, an online resource, I'm not aware of any that would, if the analogy is to, let's say, a retirement calculator where you can go to many different, let's say, brokerage websites or mutual fund company websites, and they'll have a retirement calculator that you can look at. I'm not familiar with anything of that sort in this space.
So our next question is, what kind of entrance fees are you assuming? And service fees, are they average in our market or higher end?
So in the examples we went over today, it's assuming Boston area averages based on information you can obtain at Genworth's website. So Genworth releases information about cost of care each year. And so that's what we've assumed in the modeling for today. And in the examples we used, we assumed none of them had an entry fee. Entry fees are a lot more prevalent when we get to talking about CCRCs. So we'll definitely cover that in the next one.
Next question from Jeffrey. Yes or no? Are you in favor of reverse mortgages as a means of funding advanced age support issues?
It depends. Reverse mortgages are their own animal. I think perhaps at some point we'll do a webinar on reverse mortgages, but it's a subject into or unto itself.
Okay, and our next question is, how tough are CCRCs on admission, acceptance / qualification? Is this a timing risk to consider based on health status? For example, adverse selection insurance risk for the facility. And we also got a request to define CCRCs again.
Well, let's start with the second part first. So CCRCs, or continuing care retirement communities, are facilities that have either under one roof or on one campus independent living, assisted living, and nursing care. As we'll talk about in much more detail next time, CCRCs vary in terms of among other things, in terms of the amount of long-term care insurance risk they are taking on. And the ones that are taking on a lot of long-term care insurance risk are going to be more stringent in the underwriting that they do. But again, that's something that we're going to cover in considerably more detail next time.
Excellent. And I believe we have finished up the questions for today.
Perfect. Okay. So here's a summary of today's webinar. Many older people will need help later in their lives. And the options that we've looked at here provide different combinations of support for people in that circumstance. When we talk about independent living, or when we talk about assisted living, or when we talk about staying at home, it sounds very, I will call it crisp, and the alternatives are sound as if they're very clearly defined one from another. But in fact, just as houses are varied, so are independent living facilities, and so are assisted living facilities. And the combination of housing, care, and management and other services that each one offers is different. And unfortunately, there's no menu. You can't go to each facility and say, so I want a list of all the services that you provide and how much of each of them you provide and what quality it is. And if I look at the price of living in your facility, how much of it goes for just housing and how much of it goes for other things. It's a package deal. So that's what I mean by saying, or we mean by saying, mostly prix-fixe rather than a la carte. The stay-at-home pricing is a la carte, right? When you stay at home, you have a pretty good sense of what it costs, how much your real estate taxes are, and how much your insurance is, and how much your maintenance is, and so forth. And you can get a sense of how much care might cost. It is more difficult to price out the other services that might become important as time goes on. And I'm thinking in particular about the management of help and the management of the house that people might do now, but if they need care, they might find it more difficult to do. As you're thinking about whether you want to stay at home or whether you want to be in a facility or move to a facility and which one, the decision that you make is also going to, in addition to the financial considerations, that your choice is also going to depend on your personal preferences. Do you like to have control over things, or are you willing at this point to cede control over certain areas? And what kind of a support system do you have at home that you can rely on if you need more help? And the more robust that system is, the more it's possible to think about staying at home. So at the end, choosing the best option for your situation requires work, unfortunately. It requires research. It requires into what's available and how the various options compare. It requires discussion with your family to make a decision that they're comfortable with as well as you, and your family may have insights that are valuable in making that decision. And then once that research and discussion are done, it requires careful thought to come up with the option that will work best for you. So that concludes the webinar. The next webinar on CCRCs is about a month away on the 21st of April at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You can register for the upcoming webinar either in a link in our March newsletter, which will be published later this month, and you can sign up for the newsletter at our website, sensiblefinancial.com, or you can register at a special address on our website, sensiblefinancial.com/webinars. We hope that we will see you then. Thank you for coming.